What advice do you have for young women just coming up?
Just to be tenacious and know that you belong. I mean, I think probably that's the hardest thing. That's been the hardest thing for me, is feeling like I actually belong.
Especially if someone's telling you, get out of here, girl.
Yeah. And even, honestly, even looking sometimes at other women, like older or more successful women, I'll have in my life been quick to say, like, oh yeah, but they had, or but they did, or they knew, or she was married to, or, but this, she grew up there, or what, but you're entitled to it. You completely, belong to it as much as any guy, that's for sure.
You're listening to The Other 50%, A History of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris Walker. This is the podcast where I talk to successful women in entertainment and hear their stories. This week, I spoke with Alex Schwartz. Alex works as head of production at Alpha Animation. She has spent the last several years producing films, and you may recognize some titles: Bridge to Terabithia, Mr. Peabody and Sherman, Journey to the Center of the Earth, Charlotte's Web, Because of Winn-Dixie. I could go on. We sat in her office and heard her whole story from the beginning, when she was reading scripts around town for $30 a pop. This is a juicy one. You can find us at theother50%.com to see bios, photos, my blog, the coffee cups, the t-shirts. You can find us on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Overcast, Podbay, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, all the places. Please help spread the word and share this podcast with all of your friends. And I have another podcast called The Other 50%, A History of Tech. You can also find it on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or on the Other 50% website. And that is where I talk to successful women in tech and hear their stories. Okay, here's Alex.
What do you do?
I am the head of production at Alpha Animation, which is a new animation studio that is a division of the very large Chinese company Alpha Group. Mm-hmm. And I'm a producer and studio executive by trade.
Of animation specifically?
Well, I've been doing animation for the past 10 years. I started in the business about 25 years ago and started in live action. And
yeah, tell us about that. How'd you start? What did you want to be when you grew up?
When I grew up, I wanted to make films. I really got interested in the idea of making films when I was in high school. Because I love movies. I mean, I just love them more than anything in the world. I also loved reading. I grew up in New York City. And I loved reading, and I became very close to my English teacher in high school, who was a very wealthy man, strangely.
And your teacher?
Yeah, my teacher. I mean, he just happened to be the heir to a huge fortune and had this fabulous brownstone on 88th Street. And he would take his, sort of favorite students. You could do things like this in the 70s, and not get arrested. And would take his favorite students over to his brownstone. And he had a 3/4-inch tape deck, which, like, who had that,
Yeah.
And he actually had a lot of movies that he had collected on 3/4-inch tape. So really, other than, I always loved movies, and I watched, back in the days when there were only, like, 5 television channels in New York City, like, you'd watch the 4:30 movie because there was nothing else on. So that would be, Westerns and all that stuff.
Everyone watched the same thing.
Yeah. But Alec, my teacher, had really collected film because he was really studied film. So he was the person who first turned me on to things like, Stanley Kubrick or David Lean or, Francois Truffaut or whatever. Those were films that he had collected, and we would watch them and just, thought it was the most interesting and amazing thing. And I think that's what really got me into the idea of film as an art, I guess, and as a thing to wrap your head in and just be utterly fascinated by.
And a thing you could do.
Well, I don't know that I figured that out. That was a bigger leap. I went to college. I studied art history, and film. I went to film classes and stuff like that. I went to school in Boston. I went to BU. So there was a tremendous amount of great film revival and independent film. And you could just see movies constantly. But I really didn't know how to actually get into it. And when I got out of school, I went back to New York City, and I felt originally, I think my understanding of making film was that you really had to have a craft, like a tech craft. And so initially, actually, my first thing I tried to do was get a job in a camera house, and was literally just laughed out the door.
I was gonna
as
say.
A woman or a girl, forget it. And I didn't have, I suppose if it was a an indomitable passion, I would have kept at it. And, because some girls actually did get into camera departments, but very few.
But you got to be so tenacious.
But I was just flatly rejected. It was like, we're not even going to have a conversation. Yeah, like, get out of here.
Wow.
So but I worked as a PA, and I worked on mostly commercials, because that was a lot what was happening in New York, and a few features. And then I got a job as an apprentice film editor in a commercial house, and I did that. And then I sort of somehow, I guess I felt that was not satisfying to me. I ended up getting a job in a production house, as sort of grew into a baby line producer. But commercials would just bored me to death. I mean, it was just beyond tedious. And so I decided I would go to graduate school. I wanted to make documentaries. That was what I concluded I wanted to do. So I applied to graduate school at NYU, and much to my amazement, I got a full scholarship because I had all this actual sort of technical workability. Yeah. So they pulled me in to oversee what they called electronic news gathering as a TA. So I took all the undergraduates out on their field reporting, and I did the camera, I did the editing, so it was kind of great.
I asked someone the other day, what's an E&G crew going for these days? And they were like, no one even says that anymore.
Right. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, okay,
yeah.
Cool.
But anyway, so that turned out not to be the path for me. I did finally get a job with a documentary production company that was doing a series on the Cold War, an endless series on the Cold War for A&E, which was owned by ABC and run by ABC News. And I did that for a couple of years and met my best friend ever, and who's still my best friend ever, so I have that to thank for that. But that also felt to me like it was so constraining, and I just wasn't, at the end of the day, really turned on by it. But I was turned on still by the idea very much of telling stories, and realized that I had to go into narrative filmmaking. Like that was just what I needed to do. And I still, in spite of having now worked for 4 years and gone to graduate school, didn't really know how to do it. But I did know that it was going to be in LA. And so I picked myself up and with my couple of credit cards and moved to LA and stayed at my dad's friend's house for 6 weeks and then found an apartment. And
so you just moved?
I just moved.
Without a job?
I threw myself a big dinner party. I made Indian food for about 40 people, which I had never made. I look back on that time and I think I was somehow like in a just state of utter fearlessness,
Yeah, I was going to say.
So, and I just sort of came out here and got a job through a temp agency. It must have been a temp agency that placed people in the entertainment business, because the temp job that I got, that was my first job, was at Castle Rock Entertainment, and they were super hot then, and I was temp assisting Martin Schaefer, who was the head of production for Castle Rock. And I was that job was only going to be 2 weeks. So I was like, okay, I've got to somehow make a foothold into this business in 2 weeks. And the way I did that was that, and by the way, it was so cool. Like, they were just reading the first drafts of Misery, and I was like on the desk reading, and I was just like, this is exactly what I thought. This is it.
I did it right.
This girl, who also remains a friend of mine to this day, was the story editor. She was from Brooklyn, and we sort of bonded, and I just said, when I leave here, can I read for you? She was like, of course. So then I was a reader at Castle Rock through a whole disastrous period of my life, and Morgan Creek and Fonda Films and TriStar, and I just ran around town reading scripts and getting my $30 checks, and I made like no money, but I really did meet a lot of people, and it was an unbelievable training in story, because I had to read and evaluate material, and more than that, get the executives to notice my coverage and to to want me to be the reader. You know what I mean? Like, there's a point where you're like, I want that girl to read my stuff.
And how'd you figure out how to do that?
Well, part of it, I have to admit, my journalism training was fantastic, because I could write fast and I could write clear. Yeah. And succinctly. And that is just in that particular, if you also have a good opinion, and it obviously isn't going to do you good if you have literally bad taste or nothing to say, but it was certainly made my coverage good, I think. And, and I was just like chatty and, gregarious, and sort of that's the kind of person I am outwardly. So anyway, that seemed to gather me a lot of kind of, starting to know people. And through that, not to go into too much detail, but they told me I really wanted and needed a job, and it was recommended to me that I become an assistant for these two producers whose husbands were both big studio chiefs, and they were starting up a production company, and I worked for them. But they could only afford to pay me 3 days a week, and I would go to this like incredible mansion in Pacific Palisades.
Oh, yeah.
But they could only afford to pay me 3 days a week, but I loved
really?
them, and I know. But at the time, I was kind of like, really, can I at least take lunch out of your kitchen? And so then
Can you tell us who that was?
Well, yeah, they were fabulous, by the way. I love these women very much. It was Donna Roth and Susan Arnold, and they were super encouraging to me, really supportive, of my ambition. And their recommendation when they, felt like they weren't going to be able to give me a full launching pad was that I get a job at an agency, because then I would meet everyone and then everything would happen.
Smart.
So and someone they knew was looking for an assistant in an agency, and I went and I got a job as an assistant at the agency. And I was miserable within 24 hours. I wanted to like poke myself in the eye. I couldn't believe it. And after 2 days, I quit.
Wait, what was so bad about it?
Well, first of all, I was in this cubicle, and it was very confining, and the work that I was being needed to do was incredibly tedious in terms of like the sort of the very specific requirements of this person that had to do with like minutia, like the formatting of the phone sheet and at what times of day I had to make Xeroxes of the call sheet, and what color highlighters I was, just like stuff that I found unbearable and uninteresting. Wow. And I was just very depressed.
You're like, no.
Yeah, it was terrible. So I quit after 2 days. And he was outraged.
He's like, you'll never make it in this town.
You have to stay 2 weeks to train your replacement. And I was like, train my replacement? I don't know anything. I've only been here 2 days.
I'm not trained.
But I was, I was so at a loss anyway. I was like, yeah, I don't have anything else to do, so I'll stay 2 weeks. But thinking back on it, I must have been miserable because I had no plan. I had to not stay there. But I was working on this desk, and the phone rang, and this woman who I had been a reader for at Morgan Creek, her name then was Romy Straussman, said, Alex, what are you doing there? And I just like burst into tears.
I'm trying to get out.
Exactly. She said, God, you want to come interview to be a creative executive at Disney? Because that's where I'm working now.
Yeah.
And I literally, in my mind, I'm like, I don't even know what a creative executive is. And I'm like, yes, I do. I absolutely do. Where do I go? So I go through this incredibly rigorous interview process at Disney, which was in the 90s, now they're obviously like the super juggernaut of entertainment, but they were very, it was still a very sort of driven kind of a place, because it was having had come out of kind of its era of total dormancy. So it was very intense and very corporate, I guess, at least in the appearances of it, and everybody wore suits, and they were hiring all these MBAs, and everybody went to, the junior people all went to Ivy League schools and all that stuff. Not the, Jeffrey Katzenberg, I think, and I don't know about Michael Eisner might have graduated. Certainly Jeffrey didn't go to college.
But all the assistants are out of Harvard.
Yeah, exactly. And I thought, never, ever, ever are they going to hire me. I mean, I went into this, these interviews where there'd be like, 10 people in the room, and I'd think like all the girls looked to me like airline stewardesses. They all had on like skirt suits, and I didn't know anything like that. And I would try to make myself look, professional. And I know in hindsight that I wasn't very good at it.
But you're the creative.
But lo and behold, I got this job, which completely amazed me. And anyway, that was that. I mean, I got that job at Disney, and I was immediately plunged into the real business of developing story. It was like you were just in there, and within, some short period of months, you were on movies that were getting made, and, you were in dailies, and it was like a dream come true. I mean, it was super hard, and they worked us like, you can only imagine, just it was unforgivable the way that they made us work. but it was amazing. And, I was there for 8 years and became a senior VP there. And it was, it was just this tremendous thing.
All right, so you figured out that job.
I figured out that job. I did.
Talk about being in you think it's the worst place in the world, and it's the absolute right place at the right time for the right thing.
Yeah, absolutely. It was. But, it had I got, had pregnant with my first child when I was there, and there were, at that point, I was the only female senior executive. There had been others before me, but I was the only one in the group at the time. And I was the only one who'd ever been pregnant there in any
How did they react?
Well, they didn't, my bosses didn't really react one way or the other. I mean, which I guess means they reacted fine. I mean, nobody, but my colleagues saw it as an opportunity to kill me. And, that was kind of difficult, and
That's disappointing.
It was just exhausting, and but I stayed there for a little while, I guess. Well, probably only stayed there till my daughter was like a year and a half, and then I decided I had to get out of there.
So what did you do after that?
Well, I was hired by a guy who had been sort of a Disney stalwart, this producer by the name of Steve Ruther, who had produced Pretty Woman. He had gotten an enormous fund, one of the first kind of big, foreign funds to establish a production company at Warner Brothers that was going to feed Warner Brothers. So it was called Bel Air Entertainment.
Yeah, those were good deals.
And it was an amazing deal. But he was a really, really difficult person to work for, and kind of notorious for all kinds of difficulties. And that job, being in that job, I ended up doing things that made me feel morally compromised.
Like what?
Like firing somebody I didn't think deserved to be fired because he really wanted me to fire them. And that was probably the one that really broke my, soul. I quit my job. I mean, but I really went through like a sort of crisis. I also didn't love the movies we were making. They were, we were making these big star-driven movies. We made, they weren't terrible, but they just weren't. We made Rockstar, and we made Message in a Bottle, and we made the one that was sort of that I brought in was Pay It Forward. Anyway, so they were all big kind of star-driven movies, but they weren't, for me, great movies. And so I quit, and I moved to New York in a Winnebago with my husband and my daughter and my two dogs, as one does, because, why not just,
change everything.
Kill the fly with a hammer.
What were you going to do in New York?
Well, I hadn't a plan. I didn't have a job. This is my MO.
Did your husband have a job?
No. So we moved, but we're from New York, so there was something.
This is going home.
We're going home.
It's reasonable.
Yeah. So we did that, and I scrambled around looking for a job, which there weren't a lot in New York. There was, sort of Miramax and De Niro's company and sort of indie film. And none of those were really quite right for me at the time. And lo and behold, I decided I was going to be an independent producer. And this is where Kismet, I've had a lot of Kismet in my life, I have to say. I was looking for material to produce, and I read this book, Holes, by Louis Sacker, and I went to see if I could get the rights to it, and I was told that the rights were held by this company, Walden Media. So I went to meet with them with the idea that they might be a good place for me to bring material, since they liked that book and I liked that book.
You seem to be in alignment.
Right. So I went and I met with them, and I loved what they were doing. The sort of statement of that company was that they were going to make films based on classic children's literature, but make great movies. And I thought that was amazing.
Like, I'm in.
I'm in. But I wasn't in. And so
they didn't know you yet.
A couple of weeks later, well, I actually knew the CEO of the company because we had been creative executives at the same time. He was at Warner Brothers when I was at Disney, so I vaguely knew him. But anyway, I met with them, and then I literally called them. But I mean, I needed a job. I mean, it was also down to I really need a job.
I'm getting a little nervous for you because now you're in New York with your job, with a family.
Yeah, exactly. And I called him up and I just said, I think you should hire me. I really think you could use me. And the guy who was at the time, head of production there, Joel Stillerman, said, and he's now head of Hulu, said, you're right. I think you're right. Like, I've been kind of thinking about that. I think you're right. So I went and got a job there, as sort of, just on his right hand or whatever.
What made you think you could call him up and say, hey, hire me?
I'll be totally honest with you. I really needed a job. And I thought that was a place I could do a good job. I don't think I would have had an easy time selling myself to a place that I didn't think I would do a good job. Do you know what I mean? I don't think I could have called the New York Times and said, I think you need me.
You're like, I need to be there.
But I felt like, you know what? They really could use me.
Yeah.
I'm perfect. They need me.
And you were still fearless.
And necessity is the mother of, balls. So and that, it was a startup, and that was kind of an interesting experience because I had worked for 2 giant studios, Disney and Warner Brothers.
Yeah, it's a whole different thing.
And
you have the whole box.
Yeah, literally, I got there and they had forgotten to have an office for me.
Oh, yeah.
But they had these 2 conference rooms, the big conference room and the small conference room. And I said, okay, well, I'm just going to make this my office, and moved into the small conference room, which added a great deal of speed to the finding of an office for me. But it turned out to be fantastic. First of all, Joel Stillerman was the most wonderful person to work with. I worked with him for 2 years, and then the whole company moved to LA.
Now did you make holes while you were there?
Yeah, absolutely. I made holes, and it was a great, amazing, wonderful experience. And I'm still friends with Andy Davis, and yeah, that was awesome. And but the company then moved to California. Joel had no intention of moving in California, and also just was at some odds with the company in other ways. So I ended up getting his job and moving which I was very happy to move back to California because.
And what was the job? CEO?
I was like head of production.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, the CEO was Cary Granite, and I was happy to have that job and move back to California. I guess I also had a baby. Yeah, I had a baby.
Where? When?
I had a baby in 2002. So, and we moved out to California I got pregnant a month after I started that job. And I tried not to tell them, which was kind of hilarious.
How'd that go?
Well, by the time I told them, it was like, really?
They're like, yeah.
Yeah.
We're trying not to say anything.
Yeah, exactly. Like, okay, yeah, we got that. Anyway, so then we moved out here. And
I get the feeling, though, it didn't faze you at all. You were just
it didn't faze me that much in terms of work.
Yeah.
It fazed me. Yeah, it didn't faze me that much in terms of work. This is a sort of a weird digression, but I found out that I was pregnant with my daughter on 9/11, like right before the whole thing happened. Mm-hmm. I was in the doctor's office at like 8 a.m., and then it all sort of happened, and it was
your whole world changed that day.
Yeah, it was a very intense time to be in New York, like that whole time, and I think that's part of why I was happy to leave, because it was just hard.
It's too much.
Yeah, it was a lot. So, and the other part of it being, if you're working in film, so much of it is here, particularly if you're doing the kinds of more studio-oriented movies that we were doing. I was on the phone every night till 11 o'clock. I was constantly having to fly out here. I was like, it would just be better to just be here again. And so, and I was happy with what I was doing. So then I was happy to be wherever, Did
you still have the Winnebago?
The Winnebago was dropped off in New Jersey. So I moved back out here, and I was at Walden for quite some time. And that company is owned by an independent billionaire financier, and he was very supportive of what we were doing until, certain counselors that he had decided that he shouldn't be, and people were sort of angling for their piece of it, and they fired everybody. I was kind of devastated, but it was that weird feeling of like devastation followed by like feeling like you could fly, because
freedom.
And
wait, how long after you moved to LA did that all happen?
4 years.
Okay.
Yeah. I made a lot of movies there. I made Holes. I made Bridge to Terabithia. I made Nims Island. I made Journey to the Center of the Earth. I made Charlotte's Web. I made Because of Winn-Dixie. I made How to Eat Fried Worms. I made
all the good movies.
A lot of movies there.
All the movies that we were watching at my house for all those years.
Yeah. So it was, you know, it was so great. But then so then I got fired, and my kids, I remember, particularly my younger daughter, who I guess was like, what would she have been? No, 8. She was 6. Was very upset because she'd only ever known me working at this company, and you know, it seemed very important to her, and she was just freaked out. And
was she worried?
She was worried, and I remember I said to her, and I really do feel this way. It's certainly true for you know, studio heads, and obviously I wasn't the head of the studio. Maybe I should have been, but I wasn't. But still, at a certain level, I'm like, you know, it's never your job. You're just borrowing it.
Yeah.
You know, it's like you have it, and then somebody else gets it, and then you get somebody else's, and that's the way it works in Hollywood.
And it all moves around like chess pieces.
And don't worry, you know. Not that I wasn't worried, but...
You're not going to tell her that.
But once again, you know, I read somewhere that women always attribute whatever successes they've had to luck.
Yeah.
And I'm doing it right now.
Totally.
I know. So I know that it's also...
Own it a little.
You know, work and success and being good at what you do.
Yeah.
But there is an element of timing to everything, too.
Sure.
And maybe that's a combination of luck and being good.
What is that phrase, like, luck is really just timing meets hard work?
Yeah, that's right.
Something like that?
I think that's what it is, because I do work hard.
Yeah.
Anyway, I get this call. I mean, I, you know, put the word out, or the word was out, you know.
Word gets out.
Word gets out, you know.
It's a surprisingly small town.
I get a call from DreamWorks, from Jeffrey Katzenberg, that he needs a new head of development at DreamWorks. And did I want to come in and talk about it? And I was, you know, a little apprehensive because I hadn't done animation. I'd done effects, but not animation at all. And he said, oh, no, it's the same. It's absolutely the same.
It's story.
Yeah, it's not the same, though. It really isn't the same. But I got the job. I mean, the thing with Jeffrey is I feel like once he was meeting with me, he'd already decided he was hiring me. Like, I didn't know that. You know, I still thought I had choices. I was like, well, I could go work at Universal. He called me like every day. So, okay, when? I
think when Jeffrey Katzenberg himself is calling you, it's a good indication.
So I was like, okay, I'll do it. And I went there to be head of development, and then I was there for 8 years. It was phenomenal. I mean, I wasn't head of development the whole time because at a certain point I sort of stepped aside, I guess, to produce this movie, Mr. Peabody and Sherman. Mm-hmm. And then after that, I was developing some movies there, which then everything at the studio went, you know, kind of haywire because, you know,
when it broke into pieces,
people were getting fired, and it was, you know, they shut down the Northern California studio, you know, and the sort of final bit being the studio getting sold and Jeffrey leaving. But I was sort of there all for the beginning of that turmoil, and I was out of there at the end of 2015.
So what movies did you make there?
Well, in development, I made Madagascar 3, How to Train Your Dragon, Shrek 4, Megamind, Monsters vs. Aliens, Turbo, Rise of the Guardians, Peabody and Sherman, and then the last couple of movies that I had brought in really got released after I left, which were Home and Trolls. So, a bunch.
It's pretty good.
It was a bunch. It was great. And so the long story short, I love animation. I mean, animation for me, you know, is the ultimate purest form of story. You know, because you are inventing the entire world. And because the process is so iterative and so collaborative, you're really creating a story, you know, sort of, it isn't, I guess, it's just a much more collaborative effort, you know, because you're also creating a visual story, and you have all these different sort of parts that you're bringing together. And if you sort of span all of them in terms of, as a producer, you know, you're creating this whole world, or you're certainly a piece of the, you know, it's like you're trying to hold the world on the track, mm-hmm. you know, and
it takes forever, doesn't it?
And it takes forever. Well, it takes about, you know, 2 years to make one of these movies, and it takes a couple of years certainly to get one up on its feet, to get ready to actually make.
Yeah.
But the other thing about it is I think because in the kind of animation that I do, which is really commercial and sort of mainstream animation feature, the target audiences for these movies is everybody.
Yeah.
And that is a really challenging needle to thread. And if you like that, I mean, if you enjoy, as I do, kind of, for me, it's like a Rubik's Cube. I was thinking about it this morning because I have to go give some talk in China. Well, I agreed to do it. I'm not being forced to do it. But
I have an opportunity.
And I was trying to think about, how I would describe, the process that I go through trying to get a movie that I think is going to succeed as a big commercial movie, and how it's like a Rubik's Cube because you need all of these different elements to occur. You need the movie to be funny. Mm-hmm. You need it to be emotional. You need it to be relatable to children. You need it to be relatable to adults. You need it to
have the jokes going over the kid's head and landing in the parents.
Right. You need to have this sort of thematic underpinning to it that is solid and actually carries through the movie. You need to have, a very delicious, engaging visual world for the thing to occur in. It's like, and you need a villain or some kind of an opposition that is worthy. So you're constantly like, you're like, oh shit, but oh wait, but we're not really getting the character buy-in. And you're like constantly, playing with this Rubik's Cube, trying to get it to be all
the pieces.
All whatever you do with the Rubik's Cube. Every side to be the right color. I don't actually have any idea how to do a Rubik's Cube. But, and that's great. I mean, I think about it, it's sort of par for the course that I would actually love that because I love jigsaw puzzles, and I love crossword puzzles, and I love puzzles.
It's all a big puzzle.
I love puzzles.
Now, how do you know when you read something where you're like, aha, that is it? That's good.
Well, when it feels, for one thing, retains my interest because much of reading screenplays is painful. Mm-hmm. And when it feels authentic, but I should say in animation, we almost never read a script. Like a movie never starts with a script that comes in the door. I mean, that might happen at some point somewhere. It's not like it's never happened. If Megamind actually came into DreamWorks as a script that had been developed for live action, but no movie that I've ever originated or that happened around me, maybe other than that, came from a script.
Then how does it happen?
It either comes from a book, and again, it's because of that needle that you're trying to thread. So I feel like the best films come from a seed in animation, and the seed is a wonderful character and a compelling situation. It's almost like you're an improv actor on stage, and they say, panda, kung fu, and like now you're going to figure out the movie,
Yeah.
And so generally, I mean, for instance, here at Alpha, we're not a giant studio. We're going to make one movie a year. So right now we're probably developing maybe 8 things, with any real seriousness. We have some other things that are kind of like, that would be maybe interesting. And 2 of those came in as pitches where a writer came in with a story that seemed like the basis for something. And the rest are completely original ideas, where we went, wouldn't it be great? What about this? Or isn't, and we're sort of collaborative. I mean, they came out of conversations with, there was an artist and there was me and then we maybe go out to writers and writers pitch us back versions of that idea. We, hire people in visual development to start, realizing what that might look like. And then we're writing scripts.
Yeah.
So, but those are not ideas that came in as movies. And I think part of it is just that it is hard to, it's hard for people to anticipate. Also, in different animation studios, I also think, are navigating around different issues. So it's hard to hit the target when you're not inside knowing what the target is rarely, I feel like the target is rarely a defined destination. It's all about what you're navigating around. And on the other side of that is the target.
What do you mean?
Well, for instance, I would not want to make a movie. I got a lot of submissions early on here that involved the behind the scenes lines of pets. Now, why people would submit that to me when The Secret Lives of Pets was, imminent and then out.
Yeah. There's like 5 of them out.
It's like, why are we even thinking about that?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? But people who are not, selling are sometimes not thinking about the things that you need to think about. It could be, let's just say, as a Chinese company, there are very few things that we wouldn't do in animation. There aren't really as many kind of workarounds as you might think, but we do know that ghosts are not something that plays well in China. And China is, probably half, it's coming up on being as big as the American box office.
Yeah.
So, the movies about the animals who see ghosts, it's like
that's not the one you're looking for.
That's not the one I'm looking for. So, but to some extent, it's like being aware of what's out there on the horizon, or recognizing that your thing is similar to something else, even if it's not the exact same thing. Mm-hmm. The experience of it may feel like the same thing.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? And so that that's, I guess, a kind of a basic idea of what you might want to work around. Or a lot of times I think people's concept of what might make a good animated movie is too precious and sort of charming and small, or too U.S. centric, which, China aside, movies about, a baseball bat or about, even a football team isn't really an international play. Holiday movies, people submit a lot of holiday movies. Holiday movies have a very narrow and, sort of rigid window. It's not, ideally, I don't want to develop a movie that's forced into a specific window like that, because I don't know what else is going to be competing in that window, or, it's a limited, anyway. So there are all these different things that people don't necessarily consider when they're bringing in their various screenplays. And that's why I think sometimes it's, because like I'm trying to remember what I recently heard a pitch that was pitched to me. It was an interesting idea, and it was pitched to me as a Halloween movie. And then I said, well, it doesn't really have to take place at Halloween, does it? And he was like, well, no, actually it doesn't. Somebody had gone out and written that script. So it was great that it was a pitch, because I could say, like, this is actually a great idea.
Yeah.
The Halloween thing was just, an extra.
Don't write 60 pages on that.
Don't do that, But if you'd written the script, the whole thing would be set in Halloween.
Right,
and then you'd have, be like, well, that's more trouble than it's worth,
So if someone is trying to develop animation, do you recommend that they pitch before they ever start writing? Mm-hmm. That's a good tip.
Absolutely. I recommend that they pitch, and that they, if it's something where there's a visual element that would really be helpful to express, reference images are great too, Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to be animatic, but I mean, just like, this is what this forest looks like.
Yeah.
Or, this is,
It's a taste.
Right, just a taste. But definitely pitch.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I would say 99.9% of the time, just pitch.
Now, you obviously have very great taste, and it sounds like you've always known you've had good taste. Like, have you always been that confident about your opinion about what you're making?
I would say so. I don't know why.
Like, that wasn't something you had to develop. You were just like, this is what I like, and I'm going to tell you.
I guess I have a strong feeling about, I guess the thing I have maybe the strongest feeling about is kind of authenticity. And when I think something doesn't feel real, or doesn't feel like no one would ever, because one of the things about animated movies, when I bring it back to animated movies, is that, you have all kinds of fantastical situations, often fantastical creatures, or, animals living, where you're into the, the internal thoughts and feelings of, a hedgehog or whatever. But it all comes back to how we relate to it, Mm-hmm. So everything really goes through a human filter. We don't really know what a hedgehog thinks, and probably we don't really care what a hedgehog thinks. Do you know what I mean? But we do know what people do, and how we feel. And to me, that is sort of the key to the success of the thing, is having your characters react and act in a way that a person really would, confronted with that situation.
Even if they're a hedgehog.
Even if they're a hedgehog, or a, I don't know, a red blood cell or you know, an alien or whatever.
An emotion.
An emotion.
Whatever they might be.
Exactly. A slice of pizza. And that's, I guess I feel like maybe I have a good meter for that. And I also think, I think I have a good sense of what's funny. Although, you know, sometimes my sense of humor can be maybe a little more obscure. Like I'm very, I think I love kind of absurdist humor, which sometimes relies on knowing certain things that maybe aren't as
making
generally
some
known.
Obscure connection.
Yeah,
that makes it funny.
Yeah. But anyway, that I think, I feel I'm pretty confident about what I think is good, and you sort of have to be.
You have to be.
You know.
Yeah. Tell me this: did you experience any, gender bias along the way?
I'd have to admit, yes, I have experienced gender bias. I think it's impossible to be a woman in this industry, or maybe any coveted industry, and not experience some kind of bias. I mean, sometimes it was extremely upfront, you know, as in, you know, being told by camera houses that I was ridiculous and I should just go away and
get out of here, little girl,
and go be a script supervisor. You know, sometimes it was, you know, as I think I told you before, my male colleagues like feeling completely free to just try to sabotage me when I was pregnant with my first child, you know, and I think it's also, you know, just in all kinds of ways, honestly, in all kinds of subtle ways. I think you have to really, really take what is yours and sort of fight for it maybe a little bit harder, you know, and that's just the way it is. I mean, I think anyone who says otherwise is kind of blind. Not to say that there isn't progress. I'm sure there's progress.
Must be progress,
Must
right?
be progress. No, I mean, you know, there's progress. We're starting to see, I mean, you know, there were no women direct. I had to look back to Ida Lupino when I was a kid to find a woman who had directed a feature film. When Barbra Streisand directed Prince of Tides, it was like, you know, she stood on her head, you know, and balanced, you know, an elephant. I mean, it was just like, wow, you know,
yeah.
She directed this movie. But, you know, less so and less so. Although, I mean, there is still an enormous imbalance in Hollywood, just as there is in Washington. And, you know, I've gotten very involved in women in animation only recently. You know, I really wasn't before. I just wasn't aware of what that organization was doing. But now I am very much trying to help them with they're having this sort of, we want to reach a 50% employment by 2025. For animated, for, you know,
for animators?
For animators and, you know, people in animation production.
Great.
So we've started this committee. There was already, I guess, a television committee, but we've now started a feature film committee. Ramsey Naito, who's a producer, and I, under the auspices of Women in Animation, which is just kind of getting off the ground, where we're bringing together women, primarily directors, producers, and heads of story, to begin to try to advocate for, you know, increased hiring at the studios and in the various production companies, and also to mentor and to encourage younger women or more junior people to go for those roles, you know, to be the production designer, not just the art director, to be the head of story, not just an artist, to be the director.
And what's the point of having women in those roles? Why do we care?
Oh, well, I mean, we care because women tell stories that are relevant to women, because women have every bit as much need to express themselves as men do. You know, because we need to hear that voice. I mean, we absolutely need to hear that voice for our survival.
Amen.
So that's what I think. Anyway, really, that's it. I mean, you know, I only can speak from my own experience and from what I believe to be true, and I guess just the same way that I maybe have conviction about, you know, stories to tell, I have a certain conviction about what I think the world looks like, and you know. So.
Oh, well, tell me this: have you negotiated for yourself as you go into jobs?
Yeah, and I don't think I'm as strong as I should be.
How come?
Because I'm afraid I'll be told no. And I mean, I really have to confess, I have sometimes whined my way to some concession for myself. But I think I could be strong. That's probably my last frontier of, you know, badassery is to figure out how to do that.
Are you a success?
Kinda.
Kind of. Could we read back that list of films you made?
I mean, I've had a lot of success, I would say, relative, I guess, to, I don't know, relative to what? Relative to maybe what I thought I would have. I would say yes. If I were to have, yes, I'm a success relative to where I've stood when I was thinking, how am I going to get to do this?
Yeah. What have you not accomplished that you want to?
I haven't really, I've run a creative studio, but I haven't really run a studio fully on a complete, business down level.
Do you want to?
Maybe. It would have to be, I guess, the right place at the right time. I haven't directed a movie. I don't really know if I want to. I mean, there are
That'd
things.
Be fun.
Yeah, but it might be interesting to do that. I don't know. That sounds really preposterous, but it's not as crazy as it sounds, actually.
No.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess I've done a lot of things, and I imagine that I would like to do some other things, but I haven't fully defined what those things are.
Are you a badass?
I'm tough. I'm not easily, intimidated or dissuaded.
That sounds kind of badass.
I guess. Could be.
What advice do you have for young women just coming up?
Just to be tenacious and know that you belong. I mean, I think probably that's the hardest thing. That's been the hardest thing for me, is feeling like I actually belong.
Especially if someone's telling you, get out of here, girl.
Yeah. And even, honestly, even looking sometimes at other women, like older or more successful women, I'll have in my life been quick to say, like, oh yeah, but they had, or but they did, or they knew, or she was married to, or, but this, she grew up there, or what, but you're entitled to it. You completely, belong to it as much as any guy, that's for sure.
Do you ever feel like an imposter?
Oh, yeah. Not so much anymore. Because it's sort of like, what does that mean?
Well, at this point, you have so much evidence.
Well, and also, right, what is an imposter? I mean, an imposter is somebody who's pretending to do something, or something. I mean, if you're doing it, you're not an imposter.
Exactly.
This was kind of fun.
Fun, right?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Excellent.
You've been listening to The Other 50%, A Herstory of Hollywood. I'm Julie Harris-Walker. I'd like to thank Alex Schwartz for sharing her story, and special thanks to Jay Rowe, Danny Rosner, and Allison McQuaid for the music. Please find us on Apple Podcasts and subscribe and leave a review. And of course, on our website, theother50%.com, all spelled out, for added features, bios of our guests, pictures, the merchandise. You can also follow us on Facebook and on Twitter at Other50% and Instagram at Other50% Podcast. And don't forget to check out The Other 50%, A Herstory of Tech. Thanks for listening. See you next time.